Okay, so question number one, and this comes from Reddit, and this is an amazing question to start with for a show on political philosophy. What is the good we are pursuing in moral philosophy? So this is just like, what is your starting point? Here's my crack at this. I think the good we are pursuing is the sum total of desirable conscious experiences minus the sum total of undesirable conscious experiences. Let me translate that. So basically, I'm defending a mature consequentialism. I think the good is good conscious experiences and the bad is suffering, essentially. So I'm going to offer you two arguments or intuitions behind this idea. One epistemic, one moral. So epistemic is just like, how do we know things? What is it to know? And I think a lot of people want to say there are no coherent epistemic foundations of moral theories. Check out my discussion in the first episode with Cecile Fabre, vis-a-vis that point. I disagree. I think there are. And not only that, I think the epistemic foundations of morality are actually some of the most concrete epistemic foundations that we have for any set of theories or facts out there. Here's my starting point, is the fact of consciousness. We know consciousness exists because we experience it. The fact that you are thinking about whether you have consciousness means you have consciousness. This is Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. I think that's a really solid epistemic foundation. From that, all you really need to grant me to get the moral machinery of consequentialism up and running is that there are different experiences within consciousness. You know, some of these we might describe as pleasurable or euphoric or meaningful. Some we might describe as unpleasant or painful, but you don't even need to apply labels to it. All you need to grant me is that there are different experiences within consciousness. Now, a lot of people at this point will come along and think they're frightfully clever by asking, oh, but what makes one of those experiences more valuable than another? Well, nothing. You're asking for something which doesn't exist, which is an independent source of value. Or, I'll be a bit more cautious, there's no epistemic foundation, as far as I can see, for an alternative source of value, right? And then people will say, oh, but you know, the words that you're using to describe it, like desirable and undesirable, and they'll raise a host of methodological issues there. What do you mean by that? What makes it desirable? Blah, 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 blah. And I think what you're doing there is you're confusing methodological problems with ontological objections. So the fact that you can say that there are issues and problems with how we use language to describe different conscious experiences doesn't mean that there's not different conscious experiences. So by way of analogy, if I were to say about 10 to 13,000 people get murdered in the US each year, you could immediately start being clever and go, oh, well, what do you mean by murder? Hang on. Do you mean manslaughter? What about when the police kill someone unjustifiably? What about this and that and the other? And these are all valid and important questions, right? But that's a methodological issue in terms of how we categorize and describe a certain phenomenon. And those methodological issues might bleed into epistemology. It might be because we can't describe things clearly, we can know them less clearly. But at the end of the day, there still is living people and dead people, and there's a difference between those two. Likewise, we have sensations that we think of as suffering and other sensations, and there is an ontological difference between those things. Now, what ultimately makes that distinction morally salient? Nothing except for the nature of the experiences themselves. Now, as soon as you apply language to that, you get the same problem you do in defining murder. What does it mean by suffering? What do you mean by pleasure? What do you mean by pleasures? Well, this is a methodological issue to do with how we use language. And if you want to be a pure nominalist and say all words must have exact, precise meanings, then yeah, you are going to run into issues here, but you're going to run into issues with everything, because words do not carry exact nominalistic meanings. we are not in a Platonic universe of forms. The way we use language is much more open and fluid and flowing in a Wittgensteinian family resemblances sort of sense. So that's my epistemic foundation for morality. What is the good then, if I'm saying the good is conscious experiences? Well, I think we actually really underrate the first half of the utilitarian equation, which is the absence of suffering. So, a few months back, I had a hole in one of my teeth, and I let it go neglected, and it got all the way down to the nerve, and I got a particle stuck in there, and the undesirableness of that experience is hard to convey. I literally couldn't form sentences, I certainly couldn't sleep or anything like that. It was, imagine someone putting a power tool into your tooth. And it's much, much worse than other, it's not just worse than like getting punched in the face, it's like category different worse. It's like orders of magnitude worse than that. And so if you were to ask me, would I rather have invasive dental surgery without anaesthetic or some sum of positive goods, those group of positive goods would have to be really high. I wouldn't do it for $100. I wouldn't do it for $1,000. And I think anyone who would do it for $1,000 would either, one, not understand what they're letting themselves in for, or be coming from a place of real desperation. So if, say, a homeless person did it for $1,000, well, then that would be because that $1,000 would feed them. But that's trading off one form of suffering against another. I'm talking about how much good outweighs even just physical suffering, never mind mental suffering. And my view is it's really quite high. And so when we think about morals, when we think about what we're trying to achieve, people sort of like, because it's simple to conceptualize and you can't really show off your intellect analysing it as much, I think really neglect the idea of just getting away from suffering as a primary moral goal. The next thing I think is we need to acknowledge on the good side you're faced with a huge open-ended pluralist spectrum. There's a whole load of goods we could be desiring, and they'll be different from person to person, and they probably don't reduce down to a single metric. Now, again, that is just an epistemic, indeed ontological fact about the world, that people desire different things, and there's a plurality of positive conscious experiences, meaningfulness versus pleasure or knowledge or something like that. That's just a fact about the world that any serious moral theory will have to contend with. It's not a weakness of this specific account. Now, here's my next answer, is what's the sort of moral intuition behind this? And I'm going to start with actually a religious metaphor here. That was a whole load of philosophy. What does this look like? What does it feel like? And what it feels like is I want you to think of the person or persons you love most in the world. It could be your wife, husband, significant other, parents, your children. And ask yourself, what would you really want for them? And I think you'd get something like I described from my philosophy. I think before anything else, you would not want them to suffer, right? If you have children, what wouldn't you do to prevent someone, take the example I just gave, drilling into their teeth with that anaesthetic? What wouldn't you give for that? And also, if someone said, hey, let me drill into your child's teeth, but I'll give you an extra $100 to get them Christmas presents, you would not take that deal. And I think that just, again, reinforces my first point, which is the primacy of avoiding suffering. Then in terms of the positive, what do you want for them? Well, I think if you reflect on it, you'd actually want what they want. So if you said, well, I'd want my wife to have a career as a virtuoso violinist, you'd only really be saying that, I think, if that's what she wanted anyway. So it more maps to, I would want that person to be able to autonomously pursue their own good as defined by their own needs. And then the move I would make to a full system of morality is just imagine if you could feel that sense of love for every single person in a society. Now, as a psychological fact, I don't think we can. I think love is such an intense and such a draining emotion. We can probably only feel really true love for a handful of people at best. But what would we want for all of society if we loved all of society? And notice again, this is quite a religious move. I'm talking about universal love. This is an idea that finds its home in the religious teachings and honestly crackpots throughout the ages, but I think it's a valuable idea. So what would we want for the whole of society? Well, we'd want prohibitions that stop the worst forms of suffering. We'd want a society that exists without torture, that exists without needless violence, that exists with antibiotics and modern medicine. And then beyond that, on the positive side, because of the innate pluralism of what people desire, we'd want a society that allows them to grow and develop and pursue their own good in their own way. And so I think actually properly considered, this idea of universal love actually lands you in a moral universe that looks quite a lot like the moral universe of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Right? Now, from there, you can then start to say, well, given that starting point, what sorts of laws and policies and so on should we have? That's a separate question. But that's my starting point. At an epistemic level, we can say that we know things about morality because we know things about conscious experience, and that we know that we have it, and we have different types of conscious experience. However imperfect our understanding of it is, and the language we use to describe it is. And then on the moral side, when you think about the people you really love, you don't know everything, but you have a starting point of what is desirable for them. And so the phrase utilitarianism, as we covered on the episode By That Name with Roger Crisp, he suggests is actually the wrong name. The name Henry Sidgwick gave to it, of universal benevolence, is actually a much better idea.